Yildiz Williams from Lloyd's Register to join us. Okay, Yildiz, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Yildiz Williams. I work for Lloyd's Register. And today I will talk about business models because I think that's highly valuable and it's a little bit different than what perhaps our energy providers are perhaps talking about. It's less technical, but I thought it would be nice to tell you a bit about the business models. So the first thing I want to say that in terms of what Lloyd's Register does, we've been around for a long time. We are traditionally a classification society and we've been around since 1760. But in terms of the CHEK part of our role is not necessarily a classification society role. We're here as an advisor, and which is why the type of work that I'm doing with the partners is slightly different than what we would do traditionally, which would be class and statutory roles. So that's not the role that we're playing here, it's more advisory. In terms of the work that we do, and specifically for CHEK, you remember when Suvi gave you a presentation yesterday, there was this layer cake. And we are right at the bottom of that layer, which is called framework conditions. And there are certain elements to it, and it kind of helps with the rest of the partners how we go further with the work. That looks into legislation. So the legislation regulations that will have an impact on future ship design as well as the technologies in question. Also infrastructure in terms of fuel and other means, business models, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today, and emission management, which is a future work that we're doing. So that's the framework conditions, that bottom base, and we've done some of the work, but we're still working on others. And today's presentation, like I said, it's all about new business models. And the reason we want to do that, because at the early stages of the CHEK project, it's noticed that the current business models that we have in marine industry, it doesn't necessarily benefit all the stakeholders, and it doesn't necessarily give incentives to right stakeholders. So that's why we thought, let's have a look at it and see maybe some synergies from different industries as well to see whether we can benefit from them. So to do that, first I will very briefly mention to you what is a business model, and then we'll go from there. So in very basic form, it's actually transferring value between a business and a customer. So we're all probably quite familiar with, but they work in different ways in different sectors and different industries. And in terms of the components that we as marine industry look at it for business models, it's customer, value propositions, required investment, operations, partnerships, revenue, customer relationships, legal considerations and resources. So there's a lot of components within a business model that we need to consider, and it needs to be beneficial. For our industry, the stakeholders, we obviously to go further with the business model, we need to understand who are our stakeholders. And this slide provides you little insight to that. So if we look at it as a typical ship life cycle from planning to afterlife, the stakeholders we have will change throughout, and you see those bars, and that tells you a little bit about what part of that life cycle they kind of engage and when they fit into those relationships. So we have ship owner, charterer, shipyard, technology provider, ship manager, regulator, financier, and fuel supplier. So you see, like I said, those bars tell you where they fit in different part of the ship's life cycle. And that's really important to understand so we can prepare a business model that fits all. In terms of how these stakeholders work together, so we prepared a couple of slides. Hopefully that will give you a little bit of an insight. For each sector, it's slightly different, understandably. So if we look at it, dry and liquid bulk, it's very different than, for example, cruise. I'll try to explain a little bit. So for dry and liquid bulk, for example, if we add the technology provider as well in that stakeholder identification part, you see that relationship between the charter and the customer, and the charter and the ship owner, and how the technology provider kind of fits in there. For example, for cruise sector, the technology provider is obviously has the relationship with the ship owner. So they receive a service with a payment, and then the ship owner and operator directly deals with the customer, and therefore they receive a payment in reverse of their ticket. So that's the graph is actually trying to tell you. And what the message is really, for each sector, it's slightly different. And in the next slide, it's about the container ship sector. And they have slightly different, because it's all down to the shipper-owned container or a carrier-owned container. So again, that relationship is slightly different. The reason I'm telling you this, it will be a lot more easy to understand later on, because how those stakeholders deal with and who receives the service and who gets the revenue kind of makes a big deal when it comes to preparing a business model that is suitable for those stakeholders. So for example, for the carrier-owned container, the technology provider again provides a service and gets the revenue for that from ship owner, and the ship owner and operator deals with the customer in terms of their shipping services, and therefore the shipping fees is paid by the customer. Whereas for a shipper-owned container, then there is that agency type of shipper in the middle that dealing with the rest of the customer and the owner, if you like. So I mentioned that in terms of the current business models that we have in our industry, they're not necessarily particularly suitable the way that we want to work in the future, especially when we have new technology providers. And there are some barriers for that's probably why they're not working particularly well. And we identified a number of them. There might be more, but these are what we come out with. One of them is our industry is very traditional, and the way that we run our businesses has been around maybe the current business model that we have is about 50 to 70 years old. So, and it's quite difficult to sometimes break away from that tradition. So that's one of our barriers. The second one is the time scale of investment. So long-term investments is usually what we do in marine industry, and sometimes having those short-term investments could be seen as quite a big risk and maybe not pay the benefit. The third one is split incentives between charters and ship owners. So this is something is really, really important. Usually when a technology is being fitted on board a ship, ship owner would be expected to pay the price, but they don't necessarily harvest the benefits straight away. So, okay, they might future-proof their ship in terms of regulation and so on, but they don't get that benefit straight away, whereas the benefit usually taken by the charter, and they may not be the one that paying for that service. So that kind of split incentive is very valuable for a future business model. Another one is cross-industry investment. So what we want to see really, we also talked about it yesterday in terms of ports and even fuel suppliers, to kind of get together to provide that cross-industry investment, so that the first capital investment is not only lies on one of the stakeholders, so it's more spread around. Environmental risks. This was something that we thought in the past the marine regulations weren't as challenging as they are becoming now, or in the future we know that they will be even harder to comply. And which is why traditionally in the past it wasn't something the owner and operator really thought about in depth, Whereas now this is top agenda for them to understand the environmental risk and how the regulations are changing so fast and how to comply. And regulatory risk creating regional hierarchy. So this is another thing that when we see the international regulations not changing fast enough, we then see these regional and national requirements popping up, then it becomes even harder to comply and also very risky for an operator to perhaps invest on a technology which they don't know whether it would comply in the future for those regulations. So these are some of the barriers that we identified. So on a more positive note, how do we actually overcome these barriers? Well, we come out with 3 models, perhaps we thought. One of them is capital investment in greenhouse gas reducing technologies. Well, yes, it's obvious, but how do we do that? That's something that I want to tell you a little bit more about. Second one is technology performance guarantees. Again, this is something I'm going to tell you a little bit more about. It's about making sure that the performance is actually delivered, therefore reducing the risk. And the third one is Green Ship Finance Initiative, is again the third model I will tell you about, how the financing can be done in a way that it will benefit all the stakeholders and reduce the burden on one. So the first model I like to talk to you about, equipment as a service business model. It's also, perhaps you may have heard it in terms of power by the hour. Let me tell you a little bit more about it. So this is equipment as a service is a subscription business model. So what happens, it's that it's provided as a fee and it includes maintenance, spare parts and installation. And essentially, it shifts from you buy the service, i.e. a capital expenditure, and then you deal with the operational expenditure. So it's very different. And this was first introduced by Rolls-Royce, and it was for their aircraft engines, and it was really a huge, big, different business model compared to what we saw today and in many sectors. So in this way, like I said, it's power by the hour, so the manufacturer doesn't necessarily sell the engine, but almost leases it to the company, and then every time they use the engine, they pay a fee for it. So it makes it quite good for both parties, because as the engine is used, Rolls-Royce gets their money, but if there's a problem with the engine, then there's a huge big incentive for the technology provider to make sure that that's actually very quickly solved. And it also improves that high quality technology. So what I've also done, prepared some slides in terms of advantages and disadvantages. So in terms of advantages, well, I suppose it's quite obvious. It prepares this lovely relationship, close, consistent contact with the customer, with working together relationship, which is slightly different than what we see today, perhaps, in our industry. It provides a control over installation, operation, maintenance of the asset, and therefore the performance. So that's, again, reducing the risk for both parties. It prepares possibilities for upselling and subscription for the technology provider, because they have this good relationship with the customer, and therefore they can actually provide more services because there's that trust built in. And for a first mover, again, they're on the first step to go ahead with if there is any changes, any new developments, they are there with the good relationship that they have. They can actually be first in line. And in terms of the revenue, it has the potential to exceed the capital expenditure model that we have traditionally in our industry when we think about over a long period of time engagements. So it's all very well, but there are also challenges to everything. In terms of the challenges, agreeing with customers on the value created, obviously there is that risk, and that could be one of the challenges to overcome. It doesn't mean they can't, but that's a risk. For our industry, like I said, because we are quite traditional in the way that we operate, it can sometimes be difficult to break away from that? How do we manage that change, expectation and change management? That could be a challenge. Also, things for the, perhaps both for the technology provider and the owner and operator, is the disruptions. Of course, sometimes, we can provide, as a technology provider, you can provide a certain cost for per hour or whatever, but you don't necessarily know what's going to happen in the future, a war or a pandemic, whatever it may be. You cannot normally predict these cost increases, and that could be a risk as well for the technology provider and even for the end receiver. Suitability, for this particular business model, we looked into it when we didn't think it was particularly suitable for our industry because for large equipment, especially if, for example, for Rolls-Royce, if the engine doesn't work, they can very quickly remove it and put a new one. So therefore, there is little time that the aircraft is not working. Whereas for our industry, to take an engine out and put a new one is not going to be so simple. So maybe the way that we can look into it, which takes us to my next step, to change the way that we design ships in the future, maybe that could be a way of overcoming those challenges. So that was one of the models we looked at. The next one is called performance guarantees. That's also quite an interesting model, and I think it could be suitable for our industry. So it's what it says on the tin, performance guarantees. So the technology provider says, okay, I will guarantee you X amount of performance if you have my system, and this is how kind of the risk is managed for both parties. It defines very specific mutually agreed performance baselines, and that's really the key element in here. And then they are to make sure that both parties meet those requirements. And when the baseline is not achieved, then of course there will be penalties to be paid. And again, all of those pre-work is really vital so that there is no problems in the future. For this one is also, the performance guarantees have the benefit of sharing performance-based risks between the customer and the technology provider. And that again makes it a lot more future-proof as a business model. When we put all the risk in one of the stakeholders, it's not going to be a very good model to carry on, really. So advantages, customers are protected from downside technology performance risks by sharing the risks, like I said. Other stakeholders, such as charterers, also benefit through performance guarantees. Obviously, if they're saving on fuel, charter tends to pay for the fuel bill, therefore they will definitely benefit from it. Penalties are predefined and mutually agreed, and that will hopefully avoid any of claims that could occur. And the technology providers can form a very good long-term relationship with their customers, and then therefore they could probably reap the benefit from that in the future. If they have any other services in the future, it could be upselling or renewal opportunities for them. So having that relationship is highly important. In terms of the challenges, well, ship owners require convincing to shift from our traditional transactional model that we have today with the technology provider. I buy your technology and pay X amount of money, and that's the way that we will do it. So it's difficult to break away from that. Shipyards is one of the stakeholders, as I mentioned before, and they tend to have very strong views and influences over investments at the early stages. And they prefer to construct ships that they know about, they know their experience, and therefore they tend to have strong opinions on that. So that could be a challenge. Technical capability gaps will come up as the new technologies arises, but I suppose that's really a challenge for all of those models. It's not necessarily specific to this, and it also could be seen as an advantage because in the future those gaps could be identified to fill in and therefore improve more new technologies to arrive. And the method of defining performance benchmarks is really key, because if we don't have that and that baseline is not done properly, then the guarantee is very fuzzy, and that's not going to be good. So that's also a challenge, to make sure that that baseline and the performance benchmark is really properly addressed at the early stages. So this is all about the performance guarantee. And the next one I want to tell you about is finance sharing model. That's also quite an interesting one, and I think it could be suitable for our industry. So the way we operate today, like I said, it's in a ship's OPEX is often not borne by the ship owner. It's when it comes to fuel, of course, it's usually the charter pays for it. And because of that, ship owners are not necessarily incentivized to go and invest in big technologies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, unless it's a compliance matter. And because that risk and that, why would I invest in a system when I can't actually have the benefit from it, that needs to break away. And because of that, we said simplest strategy of implementing greenhouse gas reduction technologies on board, it would be perhaps for ship owners or the charters to provide the capital investment, and they would share that finance so that they could see, one party, one stakeholder would have their future-proofing their ship, and the other one obviously would own all the benefits in terms of reduction in fuel costs and so on. But what we also thought, this is not necessarily only those two stakeholders. We could introduce other stakeholders. For example, fuel suppliers, new fuel, alternative fuel suppliers could also benefit from this, because they also gain revenue, and therefore they could be part of that finance sharing model as well. So that's a good part of finance, and that's how it would really work. And in terms of those stakeholders that I mentioned early on, for this finance sharing model, it's really about who generates revenue from that ship. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of them. There's the ship owner, there's the technology provider, there's the financier, there's the fuel supplier, and of course the shipyard. And the charter also does, in a way, because with the technology being implemented on board, they will earn some sort of benefit from the fuel reduction. So that they're also actually in that finance sharing model in a way, if you like. So if we have all these stakeholders in that, having some sort of revenue or benefit, why can't they be a part of that finance sharing model? In terms of advantages, so reduces the capital expenditure for only burden on one of the stakeholders, so that it kind of spreads the cost among those other stakeholders, forms a long-term strategic relationship between different stakeholders that wouldn't necessarily work together, so that's also a good thing. And the payback periods could be reduced because you're sharing costs with others, and that would be a huge big benefit for all of the stakeholders as well. And of course, it helps the environment if we think about it, and compliance is something that we all have to think about. Like I said, there are challenges. So this has got a number of challenges as well. So the ship owner risk versus reward imbalance, so that could be a problem. So they may be required to take on additional operational risk without gaining the reward. So they might just say, oh, why am I doing this? I'm still putting on money that I won't be actually benefiting from. So that could be a risk. Confidence in long-term partnership is key to enabling finance arrangements, and that could sometimes, for example, risk of early charter termination. That could be something undesirable. New contracting approaches need to be applied. So this is like I said at the early on, these legal part of the contract really is vital to be addressed properly. And also, it may not be necessarily suitable for all the technology providers, so that needs to be carefully thought. One other is additional cost by the financing partner. That needs to be transferred across the value chain. But I suppose, again, that's something that we would think about for all business model. If that cost is not necessarily easily taken on board, it will have to move down the value chain. Otherwise, there is no business to be. And financing partners may be faced with substantial investment packages across multiple fleets. So if they've got a number of ships, that could be also a challenge for them to address. So these are the challenges in terms of the finance sharing. Overall, I think it's not necessarily looking so bad, but I think what we're trying to say that the current model that we have may not be so beneficial for all the parties, and we really need to start thinking outside of the box. I don't like that term, but I used it. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation, found it beneficial, and maybe learned something new. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much, Yildiz from Lloyd's Register for the presentation. I would like, please, we have the first question.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really insightful. My question is about the equipment as a service. Are we talking here about hardware or software or large energy efficiency equipment such as engines or the renewable energy? My other question is that I understand you did the stakeholders analysis and business models for shipping, but also have you considered the port's business model? Because in my view that the business model, the perfect business model of shipping will marry with the perfect business model in port. I'm just wondering about this consideration, and thank you again.
Thank you. So the first one, it could be either, so it could be a software, but in particularly this particular project that we focus on, we're looking at technology providers. So for that particular project, for CHEK, what we looked at is technology fitting on board. So greenhouse technology is fitted on board, but it could be in general a software or a hardware. In terms of a second question, ports, that is actually part of some of the models. So these stakeholders that I mentioned, they may not be directly involved, but I did mention that ports could be a part of that, where they're sharing the cost, finance sharing model. So they may not be, like I said, the fuel supplier. Okay, they may think that why would I actually invest in it? But at the end of the day, they will also receive some benefit from it. So the finance sharing model, for example, looks at all of the stakeholders, whether land-based infrastructure or ports, to be involved in that, because they will hopefully benefit from it.
Morning. Thank you for your presentation. As having a low background, I feel I'm obliged to make a few comments on what you just said. Can I kindly ask you to go to slide number 5, please? You have put in that diagram, yes, potential positions of various stakeholders. Unless somebody owns a vessel already, is not a ship owner, so aspires to be. The first point would be that this is an investor. The financier, yes, I agree, will start, yes, from that point, but the regulator also will have to move a little bit more backwards. It will go to the very initial stage, because there may be already restrictions in using specific vehicles or using specific investment models. So the regulator will have to move a little bit to the left. Sorry?
Towards planning, you're saying?
Yes, yes. Actually, even before that, we lawyers say it's after God legislation. So you will have to go a little bit further to the left. And then if you go to that slide where you made the suggestion about more or less using the aviation model, the Rolls-Royce engine, with that, the two curves that you had. I'm afraid I find it a little bit unduly complicated. One more, please. The next one.
One more?
Yes, yes. And even one more,
So
actually.
this was the equipment as a service, which is the Rolls-Royce model.
Okay, I can make the comment here.
Okay.
The aviation, as you know already, you mentioned, apart from the technical issues, is quite different. They don't have classification societies. They have only one which gives this document, and it applies everywhere. No matter what is agreed in a contractual agreement, at the end of the day, it's what the law says. In other words, even if I agree with a charterer that if there's a fine, we will apportion between ourselves that fine. At the end of the day, the legislator, whether that is domestic or international, they will look at the ship owner. They will impose that on the ship owner, and therefore, unless the ship owner has money or insurance to cover that, the vessel is exposed. The whole investment is exposed. So that's my last comment. Yes, the contractual arrangements may play a role, but at the end of the day is what the law imposes on liability to which party. And in most cases, it's the owner of the vessel. The discussion that we have now at the European Union about the ETS and having the charterer on the picture, that's very, very exceptional. And I still have doubts whether that will work at the end of the day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So basically what you're saying is that all of those business models, we need to make sure that the law is one of the top parts that we need to make sure it's tight, watertight. And that's the part to really address more than anything. Excellent, thank you.
Thank you for a really nice presentation. The attention to detail was amazing. I was a bit lost when you were discussing about the financial arrangement, especially for the part of the ship owner, on how he or she is going to benefit from investing in these alternative fuels. Considering that investment in the alternative fuels is an OPEX investment, which normally would fall to the charterer.
Yeah.
I would like you to reiterate again so that I understand correctly. I think I didn't quite get it.
No, you did understand it correctly. This is one of the challenges with all of the business models, that the owner doesn't necessarily benefit directly, apart from the fact that they can future-proof their ship so that they can think about upcoming legislation. If you remember, I mentioned that environmental regulatory risks is one of the highest compared to the past, because the regulation is becoming much more difficult to comply, and therefore the owner needs to also think that I need to make sure my ship is compliant in the future. So I think that's probably the only part that they can benefit, so to make sure that their ship compared to somebody else's is a lot more beneficial and efficient to run. Apart from that, in terms of, like you said, receiving an income like a charter, that's slightly different. So the owner will see it as future-proofing and making it more attractive for the industry.
Thank you.
I would also like to ask something.
Okay.
Would you think that different business models would be more appropriate, more suitable for different segments, maritime segments? Could that be the option?
Yes, absolutely. So if you remember, I had 2 slides which looked at different sectors and how they relate to, or how they work with various stakeholders. So bearing those in mind, different type of models will be much more suitable for different sectors, yeah.
And would you say that these 3 models would be most probably suited for decarbonization technologies?
Yes, absolutely, and this is why these are the ones that we looked at. Although the power by the hour, which is the Rolls-Royce model, we didn't think that it was that suitable for the marine industry, for application perspective. It was difficult when there was something wrong. But the others, definitely we thought that would be suitable, the way that we operate, as long as we can manage that change, and hopefully everybody would be on board to take it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Yildiz.